I would like to introduce now an intermediary tool, the so-called research framework. It's a schematic representation that interconnects information gathered during the elaboration of the research objective and information that you need for the research questions. Also, the tool integrates the so-called research perspective, meaning the glasses the researcher needs to use when taking into account the key concepts of the research design. This is the research framework connected to the third chapter of the book. There is a main difference, first of all, with the first slide. You can see here how the body of teachers it's now different. We are counting with the help of Harm, Moshtey, Medram, together with Herald Jonker. And we will provide support during the TVL sessions and also during the discussions towards the preparation of the synthesis case in the second part of the course unit. I'm not really fan of the colors I have chosen for this slide, but certainly the flow of information is critical. It's important in terms of the conceptual design. We can always start here in the problem context. The context, of course, is fed with information coming from the stakeholders in terms of the desires and later on in terms of technical requirements, and also from the system. The system should be able to provide enough information about the subsystems, interrelations, inputs, outputs, and in that system we should be able to see also the scope. And from that problem context, the problem analysis, we will find the so-called problem statement. Now the scope, information gathered from the stakeholder analysis, and the problem statement should be enough to prepare our research framework together with key concepts connected to the research that should be done. Now from there we go to the research objective. The research framework then works as a tool, an intermediary tool between the objective and the elaboration of the questions. Later on, of course, the sub-questions. The focus here is the research framework. But before we jump into the research framework, I would like to say that not always it's necessary to make use of the stakeholder analysis. Sometimes the project is quite straightforward in terms of the technical requirements, meaning, for instance, a fundamental research project done in organization or university. But I have to say that most of the time, if not all the time, it's expected a good diagram where we can see at least the inputs and outputs and the subsystems of the general system that we are dealing with. Because certainly we are answering a question or we are solving a problem, and both question and problem are interconnected to a system. But let's go back to the research framework. This is an intermediate step between the research objective and the research questions, research or design questions, in terms of practice-oriented research or theory-oriented research. This intermediate step can be a schematic representation if we follow some appropriate steps when preparing such diagram. That step-by-step approach that should be followed and that is part of a cycle. It's the one here in the slide. And we should know this cycle before we jump into the schematic representation, into the elaboration of the research framework. Actions are required. First, we capture the research objective in a brief statement. Then we determine the research object. Which part of reality are we addressing here? And with the object, we go to the research perspective, and this is one of the key concepts of the course unit. The pair of glasses that are being used by the researcher, and how the researcher is observing this reality. Now, from capturing that research perspective, then we go to the determination of the sources via scientific literature or interviews. This is internally an iterative process, of course. Now, once we have enough information coming from literature, which we will be able to create the schematic representation, the research framework. This is an iterative process. And once we have the diagram in front of us, we will see if there is some connection between the objective and the proposed questions in terms of the principle of confrontation. I would like to make here a special emphasis to the concept of research perspective, meaning those glasses again that the researcher is using to observe reality. The perspective has different options. Can be theory developing, can be theory testing, problem analyzing, design-oriented diagnostic research, or intervention-oriented research. I tend to think that when we are dealing with a fundamental research project or an engineering-based project or research more connected to social sciences, of course, we need to take a different perspective. In theory developing and theory testing is more to fundamental research. And normally, let's say the majority of the problems that will be addressed during the second part of the course unit are in the diagnostic research and also into the design research. What's the so-called artifact that is going to solve the problem? And we can leave out the intervention-oriented research because this is more connected to social sciences. And I would like really to deal with design projects or fundamental research projects as part of the course unit. I would like to finish the chapter with an example, the robot control problem example. Here we would like to get better performance in our robotic system. It could be trajectory, set point control, force control, impedance control. There are different applications. We need to gather enough information about the dynamics and the kinematics of the robot, coming from the theory. But also we need to understand the nonlinear control theory and the state of the art. How was this set of problems solved in the past? Now we create a conceptual modeling. It's a strategy. This conceptual modeling will include not only the model of the system that we are dealing with and the representation of the system, but also we will provide new strategies. And so we can implement them into the real physical system. We can have, for instance, two strategies, strategy A and strategy B. We can even compare a nonlinear approach with a linear approach in terms of efficiency, in terms of energy consumption. Those results should be analyzed. And finally, we can decide if our proposed control law will have better performance than the state of the art. And you can see how in one diagram, just in one figure, we have not only the information to understand the problem or the objective, but also we have the so-called artifact, the deliverable, connected to the questions. Everything comes in one particular diagram. And we can call this the research framework. Of course, it can be extended. We can add more elements to the top or the bottom. And we can add more testing in the top or the bottom. So the diagram becomes highly flexible. Please recall that this is an intermediate tool between the research objective and the research questions. In one place, in one diagram, we can see the theory, key concepts, and the deliverable, the artifact that solves the problem, or the key element that answers the fundamental question. Now we go to the book. You will see that the authors make a lot of emphasis in terms of recommendations, because that's the jargon of the book. And I have to say that that's mostly the jargon also for social sciences. Let's avoid that jargon and let's be very specific with the deliverable and the way we are going to validate that deliverable. For instance, in this example I just provided, I talked directly about control law and the evaluation of its performance. I didn't talk about recommendations on how to improve the performance. There is a difference between both.